8 American battleships that fought in World War II still exist today, but they did not all survive the same way. Some became museum ships. Others spent decades in reserve, waiting to see whether they would be scrapped. And some returned to combat long after World War II had ended. Today, you can find them in different parts of the United States. North Carolina is in Wilmington. Alabama is in Mobile. Massachusetts is in Fall River. But the most interesting stories began with the Iowa-class battleships. 4 of them were built during the war. Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin. They were designed as fast, heavily armed battleships capable of operating alongside carrier forces. But the war ended before they could reach their full potential. Their military careers, however, did not end in 1945. USS New Jersey returned to combat during the Korean War. Later, she served again in Vietnam. Then the battleship was decommissioned and placed in reserve. It seemed that her fighting days were finally over. But the story of the Iowa class was far from finished. USS Missouri became famous for a completely different reason. In 1945, she supported combat operations around Iwo Jima and Okinawa and took part in attacks against the Japanese mainland. Then, on September 2, 1945, Missouri became the site of one of the most important moments of the entire war. Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender on her deck in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony lasted just 23 minutes, and World War II was officially over. But Missouri did not become a museum the next day. She returned to service during the Korean War. Decades later, she was reactivated again and eventually took part in the Gulf War. She was finally decommissioned in 1992. Today, Missouri is preserved as a museum ship at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And this reveals something important about these battleships. They did not simply survive World War II. Some survived for decades of military service afterward, but others almost disappeared once the war was over. USS Alabama is a good example. After World War II, Alabama was decommissioned and placed in reserve. Like many other battleships, she faced an uncertain future. Eventually, the question became simple. Would she be preserved or cut apart for scrap? Alabama was saved. Today, the battleship remains in Mobile, Alabama, as a memorial and museum. Then there is USS Massachusetts. She fought in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters during World War II. At Casablanca, her guns fought the French battleship Jean Bart. Later, Massachusetts was sent to the Pacific, where she continued her combat service. After the war, she too was decommissioned, but she survived the scrapyard. Today, she remains preserved at Fall River, Massachusetts. So the question is no longer simply where are the last World War II battleships? The more interesting question is, how did these particular ships survive when so many of their sister battleships disappeared? And the answer becomes even more interesting when we look at the ships that returned to war decades after 1945. But for some of these ships, the war did not end in 1945. The world had changed, but the U.S. Navy once again needed powerful artillery ships. The first major test came with the Korean War. During this period, USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and USS Wisconsin returned to active combat service. Their role was different this time. They were no longer hunting enemy ships. Instead, their massive guns were used to strike targets on land. And this is where USS Wisconsin carried out some of the most important operations of her post-war career. But even after the Korean War, these battleships did not disappear. They were decommissioned again. It seemed that the age of the battleship was finally over. Then came the Vietnam War, and another unexpected turn. USS New Jersey was brought back into service. She was modernized and sent to Vietnam. A ship designed before World War II was once again firing on targets along an enemy coastline. But that still wasn't the end. In the 1980s, the U.S. Navy began modernizing the Iowa-class battleships. They received modern missiles, new radar systems, and updated weapons. Ships built for an earlier era of naval warfare were suddenly carrying weapons from a completely different generation. And then they returned to combat once again. In 1991, Missouri and Wisconsin took part in Operation Desert Storm during the Gulf War. Wisconsin launched Tomahawk cruise missiles. Missouri also used cruise missiles and her massive naval guns. It was, in many ways, the final combat chapter in the history of American battleships. After the war, they were decommissioned again, this time permanently. But a new problem appeared. What do you do with ships that the military no longer needs, but that are too historically important to destroy? That question led to their final careers, not military careers, museum careers. After Desert Storm, the era of American battleships was effectively over. But the ships themselves remained. Now their future depended not on the Navy, but on people who wanted to preserve them. USS Missouri found a new life at Pearl Harbor. Today, visitors can walk across the same deck where Japan signed the surrender in 1945. Just a short distance away is the place where the United States suffered the attack that brought it into World War II. That makes Missouri more than a museum ship. It has become part of the history it once helped create. USS New Jersey is now preserved in Camden, New Jersey. Her history is particularly unusual. She survived World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. After that, the battleship was decommissioned again. But this time, she never returned to combat. She was preserved as a museum. USS Wisconsin is now in Norfolk, Virginia. She also survived several generations of military technology. A ship designed during World War II remained part of the U.S. Navy into the age of guided missiles. Then came her final retirement. Today, these battleships can no longer return to combat, but they still allow people to see what an era of naval warfare looked like when battleships were among the most powerful weapons on the planet. And there is one important detail. Not every World War II battleship received this ending. Most were scrapped. Some survive only in photographs. Others remain on the ocean floor. The ships we can still visit today represent only a small part of the fleet that once seemed almost impossible to destroy. They survived the war. Some survived additional wars. And now they stand in different American ports, no longer as weapons, but as pieces of history. Their guns are silent, but the ships remain. Decades after World War II ended, these battleships became something they were never designed to be, witnesses to an era that will never return.